Hello, my name is Ellie Bryant. This is my case study for Ed 461 with Professor Chris Wilson. And my case study is going to be based around a participant that I was able to interview and interact with during National History Day. This student is Melissa. I was able to look at her exhibit and read her progress report for the presentation prior to meeting her, and I was highly anticipating being able to meet with her because I found her project rather interesting, the topic of her project, and I was just looking forward to being able to meet with her and ask her questions. Her exhibit was on the Black Death and how, even though it was a tragic historical event, that many triumphs were able to come from it. Now, upon just hearing a claim like that, I could easily draw from that, oh yes, from this, experience in history where this awful sickness ran rampant and killed a lot of people, that we're able to see a lot of innovations and things come about in medicine and things like that for years to follow. And just from previous exposure to a topic like this, I had just some prior knowledge myself. And so I was just curious to see what she had to say about it and what bits of evidence she liked to use to support this claim. Upon looking at her bibliography for her paper and seeing just some of her resources on her exhibit, she didn't seem to have very many different resources. She did mention having to look up some type of primary resource, but the primary resource I don't think offered her a lot of information. I think it was difficult to read visually. It was a scanned document, and I think she just found it and knew that it could be counted as her primary resource, because I'm sure that that was part of her rubric or things that she needed as she did complete this as a part of a project for her class at school. Out of the 6 contestants, she was definitely the most nervous when we interviewed her. It was interesting because she seemed kind of like proud of herself and happy with the way her project turned out when she initially just told us what it was that she did and introduced it. But as we tried our best to ask her questions that would give her an opportunity to expand on her knowledge and things that she learned, she didn't have a whole lot to say. She would make her answers very brief, and it was sometimes hard to tell that if she was actually unsure, and that's why she was answering so briefly, or as if it's because she knew that we had looked at her exhibit prior and she felt like she provided ample information. So it's almost like she seemed uncomfortable answering because she felt like the answers were just literally on a table right next to her for us to see. So she referred to her poster a lot. And that was just interesting. When we did ask her the question, what was your favorite part of completing the project? She did, before she said what her favorite part was, she mentioned how she really didn't like doing the research. And I think part of this project that was done in class that seemed taxing was she did mention how she had to record on note cards X amount of different sources, and she felt like she had a hard time finding different sources, and she felt like she was starting to read a lot of the same things over and over again, and so that was a part of the project that she didn't particularly like. Just some other things about student profile. Obviously, she was female, she was Hispanic, Based on her dress, it was really difficult to tell her socioeconomic status. I would say her family's probably middle, higher class. She, was dressed professionally and looked nice. Um, so yeah, that just initial first impressions and observations made. Um, I think that sums it up for that, and then I'll move on to talking about just some of her skills that I think she was able to bring to the project. Some skills that I was able to notice, or as I was, reflecting back, I realized I didn't have a good exposure to her reading skills. I'd like to think that just based on her writing and listening to her speak, I would make the assumption that she probably reads at her grade level. She was in 8th grade. And I feel like perhaps even picking the topic that she picked says a lot about maybe a part of history that she might be interested in, which is quite older. And so, again, didn't have the right amount of exposure and time to spend with her to find out what her reading level may be. But I feel confident saying that her reading level would definitely be maybe slightly below or at grade level. I wouldn't go as far as to say as it was above, but that wasn't a main concern I had. The writing sample that I have from her is a process paper, and so it talks about how she chose the topic and then her process of researching it and getting her exhibit ready. And definitely a lot more time was spent about her talking about how she felt about doing research and getting ready for exhibit rather than her thinking that went behind picking the topic. Essentially, she just thought, oh, this is a really bad thing that people talk about a lot, the plague or the Black Death. But I guess through her research or maybe looking up some things, she realized that, probably found some other writings that said similar things about how there are some positives that came from this experience. And so I think she just found that interesting, that it's a really sort of gory, graphic, awful time in history, but it was interesting that there are some opinions about some really great things that were able to come from it. And her writing skill, and from her writing, I also would just say pretty basic, nothing too extraordinary, and also did not really see good use of any tier 3 vocabulary, maybe a little bit of tier 2, mostly tier 1 in her writing. Listening, I think it was just a combination of nerves and also her very first time competing. She wasn't too sure what to expect. We did have to repeat ourselves quite a few times. There was absolutely no language barrier either. Earlier I mentioned in her profile that she was Hispanic, but from talking to her, she didn't really have much of an accent, and not that I know if if English is her second language or not, but she seemed very fluent, and I don't think that was part of the problem with her understanding our questions. Potentially I might have used some vocabulary that that she didn't know, and that might have confused her because I was trying to get to get some deeper explanations out of her. And I guess maybe I just need to simply ask her to explain something more in depth. But there were a couple times she asked us to repeat ourselves, but she often referred to the board, or she would kind of start looking at her board or her exhibit while we were asking our questions, sort of like she was searching the answers. I guess just as reference. Again, this could have been related to nerves. And then this exhibit that she participated in was just, your normal trifold poster board. It wasn't, it wasn't a performance or a documentary or in any of those other categories. So again, I don't think I had good access to know if what her technology skill set was, but it did seem like it was a part of her assignment with her teacher to obviously conduct research in two different ways. She did mention how she had to go to the library to find some book sources, and then on top of that, with her internet searching, be able to find some primary and secondary sources in her research. So before I go on to talk about my instructional plan, I'll sort of give just some of my personal insights as how I approach this case study next. So I chose to participate in National History Day, which was wonderful. I really appreciate the opportunity to do that. With that, I wanted to use that opportunity that I had in the time I took that day to participate in the competition. Later on throughout the semester, I did not meet with any other students that were a part of like the Flex Hour. So I really did have a really limited time with the person that I'm choosing to talk about in this case study. A lot of what I'm going to talk about is very hypothetical. I did not ever get to meet with this student again. It was just simply being able to interview her briefly during the presentation at the competition. But throughout this course and with this National History Day applying to my content area, which is social studies, which, is history, economics, government, and those other content areas that fit under social studies, it was applicable and definitely very inspiring and enlightening to me, as I'm looking forward to being able to incorporate project based learning within my own classroom. And so the way I am choosing to approach this case study is to share my insights and just thoughts about how I would try and approach an instructional plan as I would implement my own project as part of my curriculum, to make a project like this an assignment in my curriculum. I'm not going to go through exactly what that would look like. I'm going to just use the knowledge I have from Melissa and my experience with her and seeing how her project turned out and seeing where she was lacking, and share a few strategies that I learned in class this semester, and how I would implement that hypothetically prior to her giving her presentation, so that she could be better prepared and maybe overcome some of the areas that she was lacking in, or strengthen them before she were to present, so that she could potentially perform better at the National History Day when it's actually time to present. With that being said, I just want to express again where she was lacking, and then how I would plan to help get ahead of these potential outcomes or remedy them as a potential instructor in the future when I choose to do an assignment like this, and if I were able to meet with her and act in that role, how I would have planned to do it. All right, vocabulary is what I struggled with the most. Clearly, you can see that from the lack of content on the slide. Essentially, with speaking with her, with seeing what she wrote, and with seeing what was provided like on her actual exhibit, it wasn't vocabulary heavy, other than her using content specific vocabulary, meaning talking about the plague or Black Death. The one thing I want to focus on that I thought was really interesting, that I think potentially, I don't know, could have been good, but might have also kind of derailed where she chose to go with her project, is when she mentioned positive selection. I'm going to just read a passage from her process paper. Essentially, her process paper is like a page and a quarter. It's like 4 paragraphs. Um, it's just really brief. Essentially, her thesis or just her claim is she says, the reason I chose such a dark topic is pretty simple. Not many people would see the Black Death as a triumph. However, I can see the good outcome of death. Her following 2 paragraphs just continue to talk about her process, not, this isn't like an informative essay, it's just their process paper. But her concluding paragraph says, and there's really no transition, she doesn't mention anything like this prior to this final paragraph. So this final paragraph reads, finally, only the positive selection survived this horror. Millions were being killed, being separated from families. Why would death, over 50% of the population, bring us triumph? Look at it this way. The Black Death took out most people, leaving only the strongest. With only the strongest left, it meant they were the smart ones of the group. The strongest and the smartest began to build better hospitals and societies. So if another deadly disease was to come their way, then they would be able to help out and cure the disease. The human species only became stronger as a society after this event. This is why I thought the Black Death was an important topic, as some would only see it as a tragedy. End quote. With that being said, when I was speaking with her and first asked her, heard her say positive selection, I will be honest, I personally have never done research or learned about the plague in this context, with the outcome of it being like, oh, but because, good positive selection, it was just the plague, was bad, but it was sort of like this natural thing that just got rid of the weakest people so that the strongest could live. I just thought that was a really interesting perspective, and I feel like she could have expounded on it more. I don't feel like it went just as in depth as it could have, and later on I'll talk about some of the type of questions I would use as part of the curriculum as sort of like just important questions to answer in your research. So that was sort of that just explained what her interpretation of positive selection was. And one other thing I would like to mention, because I have not mentioned it yet and I think it's important to know, is that she listed a few things of why or what the triumphs were that came from the plague. One was art, just basic, and not like, oh, art got better. It's just the art got different after this time. It sort of opened the door for evolutions in art and things that normally weren't painted before, things of like that were more gruesome or more negative, like death. Artists started to depict scenes like this more often. One, because I think maybe people were desensitized to it because of just how much they were exposed to something like death after an event like this. And also, people like to record history with art, and so they just painted what was going on. So she basically just talked about how art started to evolve after such an event. The other thing is she mentioned hospitals and innovations and just better healthcare, essentially, even though this was so long ago. And I feel like that would be the strongest part of the argument. But when I specifically asked her, I said, if you had to pick just one of these things of the triumphs, which do you think is the most important that has greatly affected society today? And what she said was this positive selection. But again, it just was confusing, and she didn't really go much into depth. Tried to get a little bit more out of her. And so she said I guess another thing I think that was most important is she talked about perfume. And essentially how the idea of perfume as body fragrance came around because of this time, because people started to use herbs and spices and things like that to create these concoctions to spray on themselves or spray around their homes and such to mask the smell of death, as the amount of corpses were to rack up in villages and people's dwelling places. And so that was something that she thought was interesting. But the way that she delivered the information was by saying, without the Black Death or without the plague, we wouldn't have perfume, which I don't agree with. And so I just think it's really important to be able to use projects like this, especially research-based projects, to help students be able to interpret information. Obviously, I understand, students will understand that there's biases in everything that they read, and then how they interpret it themselves. They'll add their own bias. There's no such thing as unbiased history. But I do think that it is important to develop interpretation skills so that you are able to just develop clear opinions about the information that you are gaining or taking in through research. With that being said, I'll move on to more information about the instructional plan now. With research-based learning, or research-based projects, the literacy standard that this aligns with, it's really broad, and also a research-based project can be really broad. And I underlined just a specific area that I think it can incorporate quite a few of these concepts. So a standard would be to encompass a range of tasks or purposes and audiences. So the audiences could be the class, other classrooms, the teacher, me as the teacher, or obviously a judge at a competition like History Day. And then the candidate incorporates ethical research practices. Great time to start teaching about plagiarism, how to properly cite sources, how to properly quote sources in writing, things like that. Using multiple sources of different kinds in different ways. And then the candidate can foster written, visual, or oral communication in a variety of formats. And that's a really wonderful thing about applying a project like this to an actual real-life experience like National History Day, where there are various formats that the information can be displayed in a written, visual, or oral way. Content alignment was interesting because, again, with a research project like this where the student could pick any topic, it is so broad, but I felt like the best content standard it could fit under is this goal. 2.5 is to explain how geography enables people to comprehend the relationships between people, places, and environments over time. Now, I know how it says how geography specifically enables, the comprehension of these specific relationships, but I think we can substitute that word geography with how history, or how, and it can kind of be personalized to what the topic is that they choose. And through studying something like this, being able to say, well, how is this historical event either a triumph or a tragedy or both? You would have to be able to comprehend and synthesize your information of how there are relationships between people, places, and things, or environments, and how this causes change over time. And then I don't have a lot of specifics for this, but within this research-based learning and within a project like this, it is a wonderful opportunity to teach research technology tools, but not just for, if I'm doing research, but I feel like it would be really important to help drive home the importance of finding credible information and how easy and vast our resources are that we have available to us, especially through the internet, and be able to help students know how to identify a credible source and be able to also do it in an easy way that can make them excited about gathering new information. And then hopefully they can become little historians at heart and enjoy finding out information on their own. With that being said, that leads me into my first strategy that I think would be very important to use, and I'll explain that in the next slide. So with my strategies of how I plan to teach, something that I just really enjoyed the structure of thinking about it. I'm sure there have been ways in my life, in my education, that I've used this standard, but I really like sort of telling the students it, being able to have them say, oh, we're going to do a KWL, or they know what that is. And so I'm looking forward to implement something like this in the future. But with the KWL strategy, this is what I want to accomplish by using a strategy like this. I think that this would be the best way to just kick off brainstorming when first introducing this project. And I think then it also turns into a good way to follow up throughout and at the end of the project to help students track their own learning and also make it a way of accountability so that we can see growth. Upon them selecting what topic they want, I think it would be good for them to take a personal survey of what they already know, and then they'd be able to, sort of compare towards the end of the project and see how much they've learned once it has been, turned into knowledge that they are able to access easier and things that they're able to comprehend and explain that maybe they didn't know before they had started their research. And then also, so that is the K part, already know. The W and KWL is for what want to know, and I think this is a great goal setting strategy to help students specify the direction and the claim that they're making with how their research project is going to align with the National History Day theme of the year. This year it was triumph and tragedy. I think there was there was a sentence, but essentially it was triumph and tragedy. And they could talk about how a specific historical event was tragic or triumphant or both, how it was, something tragic that turned into something triumphant, which is what Melissa chose to do here. And then the L is learned, what you learned. And obviously their actual presentation and their final product would be this, but also if we have these, check-ins or I guess checkpoints throughout the cycle of the project, it would just be a really great way for them to track their growth and see where they're at, and also a chance of some accountability. Something that this also provides, a KWL strategy, is that it's universal in so many ways. It's great for facilitating a more independent learning environment as they understand what this 3-step strategy is. Students are more in charge of making pre-assessment of what they think they already know, and then practice thinking about what they may learn, and thinking about their own thinking, kind of a deal, and then how they might want to learn, and then review their learning. And then for me personally, would be my attempt at a scaffolding strategy. The next thing I'd like to talk about is a time order sequence. And with this, I think that a really great way for students to start to feel comfortable in synthesizing and then explaining and expressing their idea is to be able to have practice and put in the effort of creating a time order sequence. And this can just be an actual timeline. This can be an infographic that they choose to make. And so this would be an opportunity to employ various technological resources that we can explore as a class and that I can help provide ideas for. But I think that having this be a facet of the assignment that they complete in the class, not as part of their project. It could become part of their project, but just as part of like a research strategy in a way, so that their research is also more guided, and it's not just me saying you need to have, making X amount of facts that have to be on X amount of note cards with X amount of resources. This is a little bit more of a focused way for them to organize their information and maybe look for more information as they're trying to place certain events in a time sequence order. And then the last thing that I feel like kind of wraps us all together is the idea of when we learned about authentic assessment as being a form of assessment where students are asked to perform real-world tasks that demonstrate meaningful application of their knowledge and skills that they've developed throughout the process of this project. And of course, that would be actually presenting at this history day and being able to show them that there are real life applications to this in your education outside of the classroom that can lead to like scholarship opportunities and also just good social opportunities to be able to get together with other people that enjoy history and be able to learn from one another. I think it would be very important as part of this project timeline to have a presentation day in class where students can enjoy each other's work and potentially have it be a peer review moment and also a moment for me to do a last evaluation of students' work and be able to give them some last minute notes and tips to help them have a really fine-tuned and great looking and presentation and feel like they have all the tools they need to confidently be interviewed and present their project, whatever it may be, at the National History Day. With that being said, there are just a few more things that I want to add as far as things that I specifically would do to help Melissa with the alignment to the standards that I have just talked about. And so I'll talk about that in the next slide. So these are just some concluding thoughts and things that I want to mention that I would specifically have done if I was in a situation where I was a mentor, teacher for Melissa, and being able to see what she had prepared and be able to maybe ask her some more detailed questions and just have a more focused game plan of what I would like to help her with or help her improve on. I will admit, I feel like I really got caught up on just some interesting things that she decided to focus on in her project that I think it was harder for me to think of some good questions to ask her. But something that I want to focus on under at least reading and listening and writing are just some main points of like what I would talk to her about with. So I would encourage her that as she presents things, this kind of goes under speaking and reading because, again, it wasn't a environment where she had to read anything out loud to us except for when she shared some things off of her poster. But it would be that it's how important it is to include the validity of your reasoning, always referring to information as as facts that you have to back up your claim, which is really important, especially when you're talking about research in history or historical thinking. I think it would be would have been great for her to talk about like the point of view of her research, to know what kind of resources that she was reading from. Were they scholarly journals? Were they just like some eye-catching internet articles that were written, for fun? I would love to know what the point of view was for her, what she was looking for as she researched, and then what she chose to use, and so how that information is historically relevant to what she's teaching us. I think it would have been really interesting for her to be able to kind of push herself more in better comprehending the primary sources, and better utilizing them. I think it actually would have been a really even because, this time period that she's talking about was so long ago, it would be rather difficult to find primary resources, but the ones you would find, I feel like it would be really interesting to use that as some great add great validity to your reasoning. Under listening, I had what do you think and why? And I guess that might have just been a personal note for myself, because I felt like we were having some miscommunication problems, because I had to ask her the same question a few different times, because maybe I just wasn't asking it clear enough, when simply I could have just said, what do you think and why? That's just what everything you're writing down and everything you plan to say and plan to express as part of this project, you have to be prepared for someone to say, why do you think this and why? And I think that's probably what I could have gave her a better opportunity to do, to ask those questions. And then I think it, would have just helped her perform better at the competition if she was better able to answer questions like that. And then last thing under writing, I'm not sure, I did not ask this, I'm not sure if they actually had to write a research paper to go along with this. They just had their process paper. But as part of the process paper, instead of saying, oh, what's this, it seemed like the process paper was constructed this way. Introduction was just introducing the topic of your project, in introducing your research methods, introducing your methods of creating your exhibit or the actual creation of the project, and then finally what your concluding thoughts were. But I think it would be really good and this would fall under, I guess, vocabulary. It's not specific to a certain content area within history, but it is specific to the content area of research when you're talking about research in general. And it would be understanding the difference and being able to search for valid reasoning, relevant evidence, and sufficient evidence. And the sufficient evidence would, fall under, well, how much is enough, how much is too much, how much is not enough. Relevant, again, being able to kind of interpret what's the most important information, what's kind of other fun information but not the most important. And then valid, do you have really good facts to back it up? Historical evidence. And I feel like, all in all, my concluding thoughts about research-based learning and project-based learning, and being able to utilize a tool like this in curriculum, it is going to cover all these different areas of literacy, with expanding their vocabulary, but most importantly, I believe, is expanding their skill set, so that in the future, as they receive new historical information in classes, as they continue on in their education, I feel like it is so important early on to teach these students historical thinking skills, so that they can better think for themselves and develop good opinions of themselves or for themselves that are grounded in valid reasoning and relevant evidence and sufficient evidence, so that when they communicate with other people and share ideas with other people, it is clear and it is convincing and it is powerful, and more importantly, it's factual as much as it can be. Because again, like I said earlier, a bias exists in everything. But that is what information I gathered and pondered on as I experienced being able to participate in Judge in History Day. And this is my case study for Ed 461. Thank you.